In the dead of winter 1867, high in the isolated snow-blanketed mountains of the Colorado Territory, something happened that Pine Ridge would never speak of again, at least not publicly. A place of quiet worship and rugged survival. A town where the snow fell in sheets thick enough to erase even the strongest trail, suddenly found itself the center of a mystery so profound, so unsettling, that even the most devout fell silent. It began with a boy, just 9 years old. His name was Samuel Henderson, and 3 days before anyone even knew there was danger, he spoke words that would later save 17 lives. Not guesses, not coincidences, predictions, precise, unnervingly so. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It's not a ghost story passed down over campfires or twisted into legend over time. This story is carved out of real letters, official records, depositions, journals written with shaking hands by people who didn't want to believe what they saw but had no other explanation. In 1973, a dusty estate sale in Denver turned up a stack of yellowed letters bound in twine, written in the cold, meticulous hand of the Pine Ridge community's founding families. Hidden inside were the first clues, and from there, the search for truth began. This isn't just another tale of frontier superstition. It's a case that even today, over 150 years later, medical historians, neurologists, and skeptics alike still can't explain. A case where faith collided with something far beyond scripture, and science was left speechless. Samuel's strange warnings were documented by 43 witnesses. Among them, a traveling physician named Dr. Elias Monroe, a man who would eventually risk his entire career trying to understand what happened to that boy. The Colorado Territorial Archives, still preserved in the state's legal vaults, contain statements from miners, clergymen, a school teacher, and even a U.S. Marshal sent to investigate potential fraud, only to walk away convinced that something very real and very unexplainable had occurred. So before we go any further, dear listener, just know this: Sleepy History Tales isn't your average history channel. We don't serve up bedtime trivia or sanitized textbook summaries. If you're here, you're probably like us, drawn to the shadows of American history, the stories too strange to teach in school, the ones people try to bury. If that sounds like you, don't just sit there in the dark. Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because trust us, some of our most haunting tales might be closer than you think. Now then, let's return to the mountains, to a snowy Sunday in February of 1867, when it all began. But this story doesn't start with a prophecy. No. It starts with the strange chain of events that brought Samuel Henderson to Pine Ridge in the first place. Events that would later seem far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Pine Ridge sat like a whispered prayer stitched into the fabric of the Colorado wilderness. A small Presbyterian enclave of just under 300 souls clinging to existence at 8,000 feet above sea level. Surrounded by pine forests and jagged peaks, the town was more isolated than most prisons, cut off by snow and steep, unguarded passes that turned treacherous come November. The town itself had been born in 1864, when a single man, Reverend Jonathan Matthews, led his congregation westward from Missouri. Their goal to escape what they believed was a rising tide of moral rot in the eastern cities and establish a pure Christian settlement built from faith community. and sheer mountain grit. By all accounts, Matthews was a man of fire and stone. Mid-50s, silver hair swept back with oil, and a gaze so piercing that children sometimes cried when he locked eyes with them. But those who followed him didn't fear him. They revered him. He was the cornerstone of their survival. The church he built, crafted with pine from the surrounding hills and granite, hauled by mule cart, became more than just a place of worship. It was a lighthouse in the storm. Its bell could be heard echoing across the valleys even during the fiercest snow squalls, calling the faithful to prayer or warning of danger. Or each pew inside had been carved by hand, many by a quiet man named Thomas Henderson, Samuel's father. The designs were simple but reverent olive branches, dove's crosses entwined with mountain laurel. The kind of details that only a deeply devoted man would spend weeks chiseling by lantern light. Beyond the church, Pine Ridge had only the essentials: a blacksmith's forge, a one-room schoolhouse, a general store, and a collection of modest cabins clustered around a frozen creek. The nearest city, if you could call it that, was Silver Creek, 20 miles down a hazardous mountain road that often vanished under snow. Silver Creek was everything Pine Ridge wasn't. A rough mining outpost of gamblers, drinkers, and desperate men chasing silver veins into the earth, and sometimes never coming back up. The contrast between the two towns couldn't have been more stark. While Pine Ridge prayed for deliverance, Silver Creek gambled on luck. Where Pine Ridge tithed and shared, Silver Creek stole and swindled. The residents of Pine Ridge often referred to Silver Creek as Sodom on the mountain, and rarely visited unless absolutely necessary. But like it or not, they depended on it for news supplies and the occasional doctor. And among the first to arrive in Pine Ridge back in '64 had been the Henderson family. Drawn by Reverend Matthews's call for a new Eden Thomas, and Eliza Henderson had packed up their modest Missouri life and headed west with their only child Samuel. At the time, there was nothing unusual about the boy. He was quiet, observant, and polite to a fault. He loved to draw preferred books to snowball fights and could often be found watching the clouds for hours as if he were waiting for something. No one, not even his parents, suspected what would soon awaken inside him. But Pine Ridge was about to become more than just a place of sanctuary. It would become the site of something impossible. Thomas Henderson wasn't just any carpenter. In a town like Pine Ridge, where winters shattered timbers and roofs had to hold fast under 3 feet of snow, Thomas was a lifeline. He built not only homes, but hope. He raised walls the way others raised hymns. The schoolhouse, the parsonage, the sanctuary pews all bore the subtle mark of his quiet devotion. His craftsmanship was everywhere. You could run your fingers over the edges of a door frame or the arch of a window and feel it, a man trying to carve faith into wood. His wife, Margaret Henderson, carried a different kind of skill, the kind passed not from books but blood. Known across the mountain territory as Pine Ridge's midwife and healer, Margaret's knowledge of medicinal herbs had kept dozens of families alive when snow made travel impossible and fevers ran high. She knew what bark to steep for coughs, what roots eased childbirth, what poultices pulled infection from a wound. Behind their cabin just past the woodshed, she kept a narrow garden even through the frost, little wooden markers poking from the earth, feverfew Angelica blue cohosh. From her grandmother in Missouri, she had inherited a memory, so detailed it seemed at times uncanny. And when neighbors knocked at midnight with a child in seizure or a woman in labor, Margaret didn't hesitate. She packed her leather satchel with dried herbs, wrapped her shawl, and rode through the dark. But there was one ache even she couldn't mend. For years, the Hendersons had tried to conceive. In a community that saw children as proof of divine favor, their childlessness whispered like a question behind closed doors. Margaret suffered 3 miscarriages in her early years of marriage, each one deepening the quiet heartbreak that settled in their home like dust. They prayed. Oh, how they prayed. And then, in the spring of 1858, their prayers were seemingly answered. But not in the way anyone expected. That spring, Thomas was hunting deeper into the forest than usual, following deer sign along trails overgrown with moss and silence. About 5 miles north of Pine Ridge, near a forgotten bluff, known locally as Spirit Hollow, he stumbled onto something he would never forget. At first he saw smoke, then the remains of what had been a Ute family camp. What lay before him was not the aftermath of a fire. It was the wreckage of a massacre. 3 adult bodies, 2 men, 1 woman lay strewn about the blackened remnants of a traditional wickiup. The ground was torn up, belongings scattered like leaves in wind. He saw a broken necklace, a rusted blade, a medicine pouch still cinched shut. The woman's hands were burnt but folded as if she died mid-prayer. This was not an accidental fire. There were gunshot wounds, knife gashes, scorched earth. But in the charred silence, Thomas heard something else. A sound. Soft, muffled, alive. He followed it to what looked like a collapsed root cellar. Beneath the ash and soot, under a slatted door covered in dirt, he found a buffalo hide bundle, a child warm and breathing. The boy was no newborn. Maybe 18 months old. Old enough to speak a few words, though when Thomas lifted him gently, the child only stared. Wide, silent eyes. Not crying, not trembling. Just watching. Someone had hidden him there, had taken the time, even as death raged overhead, to tuck him below the fireline, cover him in furs, and pray he wouldn't be found. And the strange thing was, he hadn't been. Not by whoever had done this, but Thomas had. Now here's where the official story, the one the Hendersons told their neighbors, begins to unravel. They told Pine Ridge that Thomas had found an abandoned baby, alone, starving, left behind after some distant fire. It made for a moving tale. The kind people were quick to label Providence. And in a town aching for miracles, no one asked many questions. But in his personal journal discovered years later in a Denver archive, Thomas wrote something very different. What he described was not a chance discovery. It was a sacred site known to local Ute elders as a place of vision quests. The earth had been dug in multiple spots as if someone was searching for something hidden. Not food, not valuables, something spiritual. And worse still, the bodies bore signs not just of violence, but torture. Ligature marks, deep, deliberate wounds. The camp had not been burned in haste. It had been desecrated. Later scholars studying tribal records and oral histories would learn that this particular site was considered holy. A place where medicine men communicated with ancestral spirits. Outsiders were forbidden. It was rumored to be a gateway of sorts between the seen and unseen. Thomas never told Pine Ridge any of this. Instead, he dug 3 shallow graves and marked them with hand-carved crosses. He buried the dead without fanfare, then rode home with the child cradled in his arms. And from that day forward, he and Margaret called the boy Samuel. They never spoke of what he might have witnessed, or what might have been passed on to him in that final act of love and protection beneath the earth. But privately, Thomas worried. He wrote that sometimes the boy would stare into the woods as if remembering something he had no words for. Sometimes he would wake up from dreams screaming in a tongue no one recognized. Margaret insisted it was only the mind processing early trauma. But Thomas had his doubts, and when the events of 1867 began to unfold, when Samuel began to speak of things no child should know, Thomas would remember that ruined camp, that burned earth, and the boy's wide, unblinking eyes. And he would wonder, had something survived that fire with him? The nearest territorial marshal was more than 100 miles away, a distance that might as well have been 1,000 in a land where blizzards could swallow trails overnight and mountain passes could vanish under snow. By the time any help arrived, the killers, whoever they had been, would be long gone. But that wasn't the only reason Thomas Henderson kept the massacre a secret. He understood perhaps better than most just how fragile life was in a town like Pine Ridge. Tensions between white settlers and nearby native bands were already high. Rumors alone could spark suspicion, and the knowledge that a white family was raising an Indian child, especially one rescued from a sacred site littered with tortured corpses, could turn deadly fast. So the Hendersons chose a story more palatable to their community. They told their neighbors they'd found an abandoned infant during a hunting trip, alone, crying helpless. And Pine Ridge, a town where death was more common than weddings understood, or at least pretended to. Adopting orphans was seen as Christian duty, and the child Samuel was small, quiet, and in clear need of care. Margaret and Thomas presented their decision as a godly act of compassion. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, Samuel was baptized at the Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church, the icy water from the font trickling over his head, as Reverend Matthews declared that God himself had delivered the child to their arms. But the truth lay buried beneath a more complicated grief. What the boy had witnessed hidden in that cellar surrounded by smoke and slaughter had left deep, invisible scars. At first, no one noticed the signs. He didn't speak much. He startled at loud sounds, and on some nights, he would wake up screaming. Not in English, not even in Ute, but in a tongue no one recognized. Margaret assumed it was some fractured memory of trauma, but even she admitted in private that the language chilled her. As Samuel grew, those early signs didn't fade. They sharpened. He became a quiet, serious child, dark-haired, small for his age, but with eyes the color of green glass, pale, unblinking, and all-seeing. He noticed everything. When the wind shifted, when the animals grew still, when a storm was coming, long before clouds formed, Samuel knew. At first, Pine Ridge dismissed it as good instinct, backwoods wisdom. Nothing unusual for a boy raised in the forest. But then, little things started happening. Things people couldn't explain. Someone would lose a ring in the snow, and Samuel would walk directly to it. A neighbor would fall ill, and the boy would appear at their door with Margaret's medicine bag before anyone called for help. He seemed to know when someone was pregnant sometimes before even the mother did. And when Margaret Henderson delivered babies across the region, She began to trust Samuel's quiet warnings more than her own midwife training. He would tell her sometimes a full day in advance which births would go wrong, which would bleed, which needed her strongest herbs. At first, people in Pine Ridge chalked it up to intuition, maybe even divine favor. But as the months passed, his gifts became harder to ignore and harder to explain. He didn't guess. He knew. He knew which animals were rabid, which trails would collapse in landslides, which trees were about to fall from rot. And when a man named Abul Chroma came down with pneumonia, so sudden he couldn't speak, it was Samuel who knocked on his door with fever root and elderflower tea unprompted. This helped his reputation, but it also isolated him. Children whispered that he could hear things in the woods that weren't there. Some swore he could read minds. And while the adults appreciated his strange talents, many kept a wary distance. There was something about the boy, something just beyond normal. Samuel noticed. He stopped playing with the other children. Instead, he took to wandering the surrounding forest, often for hours at a time. He never got lost, never came back cold. The woods seemed to accept him in a way that the town never fully did. And then came the winter of 1867. It was brutal. Snow had been falling since November, thick and steady. Supply lines to Silver Creek had been severed by ice and rockfall. For over 2 months, Pine Ridge had been utterly cut off from the outside world. No letters, no trade, no doctor, just cold dwindling provisions and prayer. It was during this harsh, hungry isolation that Samuel's strange gifts would break through the veil and reveal just how deep his connection to something other truly went. On the morning of February 18th, the sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue, but the cold was punishing well below zero, with a wind that scraped skin like glass. The night before had been eerily silent, the kind of silence that only comes when winter buries every living sound. And inside the Henderson cabin, Thomas noticed something troubling. Samuel hadn't slept. He'd spent the night pacing, watching the stars through the frost-glazed window, his breathing shallow, his posture rigid. Margaret had seen this before, the same haunted look he'd had as a child, the same sleepwalking stare. By morning, Samuel still hadn't spoken. At Pine Ridge Presbyterian, nearly the entire population had gathered for Sunday service, as was their custom during the long winters. The church's simple wooden interior, normally sparse and solemn, was packed well beyond capacity. 47 adults, 16 children, elbow to elbow. The warmth of so many bodies was welcome in the cold. But what no one knew was that Samuel had already seen what was coming, and in the next few hours, he would try to stop it. If you're still with us, dear listener, you might want to take a breath. Because what happens next? It's the kind of thing that splits belief wide open between faith and fear, science and silence. And trust us, you won't forget it. Want more forgotten mysteries like this? Hit that subscribe button. And tell us, have you ever known something was wrong before you had proof? We read every story in the comments. The air inside the church was heavy, not just with reverence, but with the dense, lived-in sense of frontier survival. wool coats damp from snow-wood smoke curling from the pot-bellied stove, and the subtle sharpness of pine pitch Thomas Henderson had sealed every crack against the drafts, but even he couldn't keep out the tension that was gathering. The windows were fogged. The pews creaked under layers of wool and worry. And Reverend Matthews, standing tall in the pulpit, spoke with the kind of solemn fire that could only come from lived experience. His sermon was on the trials of Job, a man who had lost everything and still clung to faith. Matthews wasn't just preaching from scripture. He was preaching from memory. From long winters, from starving livestock, from holding hands with the dying when medicine ran out. And the people of Pine Ridge listened not with polite attention, but with the desperate focus of souls trying to believe that suffering had meaning. Among them sat Samuel Henderson in the third pew beside his parents. His face was unusually still. His pale green eyes, those unsettling crystalline eyes, were locked on the Reverend with such intensity that more than one witness would later mention it. Even Margaret, who had dismissed his mood earlier as simple exhaustion, was now uneasy. Something in him was shifting. Then it happened. Without warning, Samuel stood up. The sound of the wooden pew groaning under his sudden movement cut through the sermon like a blade. But this wasn't a child acting out. This wasn't fidgeting or boredom. He rose with a kind of gravitas, a strange, still power that seemed utterly foreign to a boy of 9. And then, in a voice too clear, too resonant and too ancient, he spoke. The earth trembles beneath Silver Creek. The church froze. No breath, no motion. Even the stove crackled quieter. Samuel's voice wasn't loud, yet everyone heard it perfectly. Like the sound wasn't coming from him, but through him. The number 17 shall be spared by the warning of the crow. When the sun reaches its highest point on the third day hence, the mountain shall swallow the greedy, and the silver shall run red with blood. There are moments in life that stamp themselves into memory with surgical precision. This was one of them. Years later, dozens of people would recall how the words seemed to vibrate inside them, not just as sound, but as truth. People described a feeling in their chests, a harmonic resonance, like standing too close to a great bell. Unsettling, impossible, holy. Samuel wasn't blinking. His eyes stared forward. Not at the Reverend, not at his parents, but seemingly through the walls of the church into some other realm. He kept speaking. Kokoapeli, Kina Machatube. The old spirits remember the sacred places where blood was spilled. 17 souls walk in darkness. But the crow brings light to the shadow places where silvermen dig their graves. Even the oldest settlers' men who had traded with Ute elders decades earlier recognized fragments in his speech. Words from dead tongues spoken fluently. Words the boy could not have known. Margaret reached for him, tears welling in her eyes not from fear, but from an old, deep maternal panic. But he didn't see her. His small frame had become unnaturally rigid, almost statue-like. His breath slowed. Deep, measured, trance-like. And then his voice lowered, so quiet, yet still somehow carrying to every corner of the church. Tell the men of the deep places. When the sun stands still in the sky on Wednesday, let no man go beneath the earth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miners' names were whispered, faces paled. The mountain is hungry, and it remembers the blood that was spilled in the sacred place. It will feed on the children of those who disturbed the sleeping spirits. The silence that followed felt almost supernatural, as if the church itself was holding its breath. Then Samuel said something that would live on in local legend. Webiatishkai. The word itself meant nothing to most of them, but the sound of it carried weight. Old weight. It rolled through the church like a chill. The mountain spirits speak through the child who was born in shadow and raised in light. But the gift comes with a price. Each vision tears a piece from the seer's soul, and the mountain grows hungry for more. And finally, in a voice now almost mournful, beware. For what was taken from the sacred place will be reclaimed, and the debt will be paid in silver and bone. The last word echoed bone, and then Samuel's legs buckled. Margaret caught him before his head struck the pew. He did not speak again that day. If you were in that church, if you heard a child speak in dead languages, predict bloodshed, and name the exact number of people who would survive, what would you do? Would you believe? Would you run? Or would you pray harder than you ever have in your life? Let us know in the comments. And if you're not already following Sleepy History Tales, now's the time. This story is just beginning. As abruptly as it had begun, the trance ended. Samuel blinked slow and dazed, glancing around the hushed church like someone waking from a dream. His voice returned to that of a normal 9-year-old, soft, confused, and utterly innocent. Why is everyone looking at me like that? He asked his mother, his small hand reaching for hers. He remembered nothing. Not the prophecy, not the strange language, not the silence that had gripped the room like a closed fist. His only concern was whether he had done something wrong. The reaction was swift and bitterly divided. Elder Marcus Blackwood, a stern-faced man in his 60s and self-appointed guardian of Pine Ridge's moral compass, shot to his feet. His gnarled finger jabbed towards Samuel like a blade. "That boy speaks with the tongue of heathens," he roared, voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "No Christian child knows such words unless he's been touched by savage influences. This evil must be cast out before it infects the rest of our children." But not all shared his view. Sarah Denton, sitting near the back, felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her brother worked the mines in Silver Creek, had for years, and Samuel's words rang uncomfortably close to what William had described in letters. Collapses, strange rock shifts, whispers in the dark. Wednesday, Samuel had said. That was the day the mines always roared back to life after their monthly safety inspections. It wasn't a vague warning, it was specific. Too specific. At the pulpit, Reverend Matthews stood frozen in place. His hands clutched his Bible tightly, knuckles white, his lips moving without sound as he processed what he'd just witnessed. He had shepherded this community through grief, famine, stillbirths, and fires. But nothing had unsettled him like what he saw in that boy's eyes. Was it a divine revelation, a miracle wrapped in mystery, or something darker, an intrusion of old spirits through the vessel of a vulnerable child? And then there were the words, the strange syllables that no English-speaking child should know. Matthews couldn't forget them, and neither could Wilhelm Strauss. Wilhelm had spent most of his life digging holes in mountains and burying friends inside them. In his younger days, he traded with Ute bands and picked up enough of their language to recognize the cadence Samuel used. It wasn't nonsense. The boy had spoken of sacred places where blood was spilled. Wilhelm knew those places well, places where miners had fought natives, and the ground still remembered. He'd seen what happened when those sites were disturbed. He'd heard of mines that simply closed themselves. Standing near the back, unnoticed by many, was Dr. Ezra Keller, a traveling physician who had just arrived the previous day to treat a winter fever outbreak. He'd seen epilepsy. He'd seen delirium. He'd seen religious mania. But this wasn't that. Samuel's speech had been too measured, too symbolic, too intentional. By the time Reverend Matthews led a closing prayer, halting and trembling, the community was already breaking into factions. Some slipped away quickly, crossing themselves as they left. Others lingered, whispering nervously. But that night, no one slept easily. Cabin doors opened and shut. Neighbors visited one another in hushed voices, asking the same questions over and over. What had they witnessed? A prophecy? A possession? Or just a fever dream from a strange little boy? Thomas Henderson kept Samuel home the rest of the day. He was quiet, tight-lipped, humiliated by the whispers he could already feel crawling around town like ants. By sundown, battle lines had formed in Pine Ridge. Some wanted Samuel banished, others called for prayer circles and holy oil. Still others dismissed it all as childish fancy, just a vivid imagination, steeped in too many campfire legends and Sunday sermons. But 3 people couldn't shake the feeling that something had truly happened. Jacob Miller, who ran the general store and traded occasionally with the mining town, did the math. Wednesday was February 21st, the very day Silver Creek resumed operations after their monthly safety checks. Sarah Denton, still clutching her brother's latest letter, remembered that William was due to arrive that Wednesday with supplies and news. And Wilhelm Strauss, haunted by years of hard-won miners' law, knew better than to ignore warnings, especially when they came from the mouths of the unexpected. But none of them acted. Not yet. They told themselves it was a test of faith, that if this was the voice of God, then God would reveal it again. And if it wasn't, well, then it was just a boy playing prophet. Not one of them sent a message to Silver Creek. Not one of them warned the miners. Not one of them intervened. They chose to wait, and that choice would mark them for the rest of their lives. The 3 days that followed Samuel's terrifying prophecy stretched like shadows in the heart of winter, long, heavy, and filled with a silence no one trusted. For the people of Pine Ridge, time no longer moved with the ticking of the church bell or the crackling of the firewood. No, it moved with stolen glances, whispered prayers, and the growing ache of question no one could answer. And in the middle of it all was a boy who acted like nothing had ever happened. Samuel laughed. He played. He helped his mother fold linens and sweep ash from the hearth. When asked gently, so gently, about what he remembered from church, he blinked in confusion as though being told a dream he'd never dreamed. There was no trace of the voice, the words, or the strange awareness that had once held an entire room spellbound. But Margaret Henderson, his mother, or at least the only one who had ever been, saw more than what Samuel said. She saw what only a mother might see. She noticed how he sometimes paused mid-play to look south toward the mountains that separated them from Silver Creek. How his brow furrowed, not like a child lost in thought, but like someone listening to something distant. A sound no one else could hear, an instinct no one else could name. As Wednesday crept closer, Samuel's restlessness deepened. He moved like an animal before a storm tense, skittish, searching for something just out of reach. And while the boy seemed adrift in his own strange rhythm, the town around him was unspooling at the seams. The congregation had splintered. The faithful were now factions. Elder Marcus Blackwood, self-appointed guardian of Pine Ridge's spiritual purity, wasted no time organizing his defense against the child. With heavy scripture in one hand and fear in the other, he walked from house to house like a prophet of old, warning of contagion, not of disease, but of spiritual rot. That boy, he said again and again, speaks in the tongue of heathens. If we allow his influence to spread, it is not just the soul of Samuel we risk, but the soul of Pine Ridge itself. Many listened, especially the parents whose own children had begun to whisper about Samuel in reverent tones. Parents who feared their sons and daughters might see his strangeness not as danger, but as a gift. But not everyone followed Blackwood. In quiet corners and lamplit kitchens, another group gathered, mostly women. Sarah Denton, Martha Caldwell, Ruth Ellis, names not recorded in history books but known in heaven's ledgers for the depth of their compassion. They saw Samuel differently. To them, he wasn't a threat. He was a message, a fragile one, a child chosen to carry something his body barely understood. They prayed for him, protected him, not with weapons or protest, but with mercy, gentleness, and trembling faith. Martha Caldwell especially felt the pull of Samuel's pain. Her own boy James had died in a mining collapse 3 winters ago. And though her grief had hollowed her, it had also made her attuned to suffering, especially the kind no one else noticed. She reminded others that God often spoke through those we dismiss, and that the Bible was full of children chosen to speak on heaven's behalf. Most folks, though, found themselves stuck somewhere in the middle, not ready to call Samuel a prophet, but too afraid to call him a liar, because Pine Ridge was a lonely place. Surrounded by wild country and winter sky, its people knew what it meant to rely on each other and on forces they could not see or name. Out here, the supernatural wasn't strange. It was simply possible. Even Dr. Ezra Keller, who had stayed longer than planned, ostensibly due to snow, but truthfully due to fascination, could not shake the mystery. He had examined many things in his life: broken bones, fevers, seizures, delusions. But this was something else. Samuel was not sick, not hysterical, not hallucinating. He was still like the air before thunder, still like the surface of a deep well. And yet, Dr. Keller, sharp-eyed and scientific, did begin to notice something peculiar in the boy's background. Little details that might mean nothing or everything. But before we dive into what Keller discovered, pause for just a moment, dear listener. If you had been in Pine Ridge, who would you have believed? The preacher who called Samuel a vessel of evil, the grieving mother who called him a mouthpiece for God, or the physician who could not explain him at all? These are the questions that linger in every historical mystery, the ones we must feel more than answer, the ones that time never quite silences. Let's continue. The 3 days that followed Samuel's shocking prophecy passed with a painful slowness, the kind of slowness that made the minutes feel like hours and the hours like days. Samuel, the boy in the middle of that whirlwind of belief and disbelief, acted as if nothing had happened. He played with the other children when the weather allowed, helped his foster mother clean and cook, and behaved with a calmness that puzzled even his parents. When asked about the incident in church, Samuel would tilt his head as if someone were telling him a story about himself that he had never experienced. Margaret Henderson, his foster mother, observed every little thing. The things only a mother would notice, the occasional glance toward the south, where Silver Creek lay behind the snowy mountains. The way he fell silent when he heard sounds she could not hear. And then there was the growing unease as Wednesday approached, reminding her of the animals that had behaved strangely before the storm. And the adults in Pine Ridge. They were no longer normal. Religion, reason, and fear of the inexplicable had torn the community apart. A group led by Elder Marcus Blackwood began calling Samuel a spiritual menace. They could not accept a child of unknown parentage speaking an ancient language with supernatural abilities living freely among them. Elder Blackwood went from house to house repeating Bible verses about false prophets and evil disguised as light. Parents who feared their children would be influenced by him were gradually won over. But a small group, mostly women in the town, saw Samuel differently. Sarah Denton and Martha Caldwell, women who had lost children or suffered great loss, formed secret prayer circles. They don't see a demon, just a frightened boy trying to say something important. For Martha, who lost her son in a mine accident, Samuel is a chance for redemption, a reminder that God still speaks through children as he did in the Bible. The rest of the town confused. They don't know what to believe. But in this frozen world in the mountains, where news is slow, and people rely on each other to survive, prophecies aren't so strange. Dr. Ezra Keller, who should have left, decides to stay in Pine Ridge. He wants to learn more about Samuel, about whether his abilities are neuroscience or psychiatry. But Samuel has no symptoms, no seizures, no mood swings. He's perfectly healthy, oddly. But he discovers something else. Samuel knows a lot about herbs and healing. He helps his foster mother treat her neighbors like a true healer. He predicts the weather with incredible accuracy. And perhaps most strangely, he can read people's emotions no matter how hard they try to hide it. Samuel can sense the fear, sadness, or whatever is weighing on their minds. Switching to the pastor's voice, slightly skeptical. Reverend Matthews, the town's old pastor, knelt in prayer for 3 days, turning the pages of his Bible as if searching for light in a dark cellar. Every day he visited the Hendersons' house, sitting and observing Samuel with a mixture of suspicion and sympathy. The boy showed no signs of anything supernatural. But that very normality confused him more than ever. Presbyterianism is a sect that puts reason next to faith. But could God reveal himself through a child? Or was this just a test of the devil? switching to his foster father's voice, more investigative, more urgent. As for Thomas Henderson, he did not pray. He investigated. He traced the story back to the day Samuel was found. He asked old tradesmen, old residents, and gradually he pieced together the picture. The place where Samuel was found was a sacred area for the Ute people, a place where shamans went to seek revelations and converse with the spirits of their ancestors. The group of people murdered, they were not strangers, they were guardians of the sacred site. And their killers were none other than a group of gold miners hired by investors in the Silver Creek mine. Could Samuel's prophecy come not from a supernatural world, but from a memory, an extension of blood passed down from his father? Could the boy carry within him the echoes of ancestors who lived and died in tragedy? But what made Thomas shudder was this: the boy was found on land associated with children who were said to have the ability to transcend the boundaries of time. And the massacre took place at the same time that the Silver Creek mine was being established. The group of miners who committed the crime, the same ones who would later help build the main shaft. So was Samuel's prophecy simply a memory, or a voice speaking through time, warning of the consequences of a crime that had never been atoned for? On Wednesday morning, Thomas awoke with a decision as heavy as a rock. What should he do? Trust his son send a warning to Silver Creek and risk being ostracized by the entire town? Or stay silent and hope that the words were just a child's imagination? But their decision, those who were wavering between action and silence, was finally snatched away from them by fate in a way no one could have foreseen. Wednesday, February 21st, 1867. Dawn swept over Pine Ridge like an oil painting, brought to life by the pure light of the high mountains. The distant snow-capped mountains seemed almost within reach, and every sound, the sound of horses' hooves, the sound of snow falling from the roofs, echoed in the thin air as if carved in stone. The sky was cloudless, the sun fixed in the high blue sky. It hung in an eerie stillness, just as little Samuel had described it when the sun stands still. And sure enough, every single person in the little town began to look up, then down at their pocket watches, then back up at the sky. They were counting not breakfast or work, but the moment when the sun would reach its highest point. They were wondering, would they see a prophecy come true today? Jacob Miller, the general store owner, had had the worst night of his life. Normally, he was a dryly practical man, known throughout the region for his careful and precise decisions. But this time, he found himself standing in the dim light of dawn, his eyes fixed on the mountain road that led to the Silver Creek mine. Part of him couldn't ignore what Samuel had said. Another part was terrified by the thought if the warning was true, then lives were at stake. Going to Silver Creek now was like playing dice with death. It was a nearly 20-mile drive, winding through snow-covered passes where one misstep could send him plummeting into a deep abyss. Send someone else he couldn't. If the prophecy was wrong, they would accuse him of sabotage, and he might even be charged with slander or disrupting the business of Denver Silver. One false word, one unfounded warning, and Pine Ridge could be shut down and buried in scandal. But what if he didn't go, and the prophecy was true? Miller knew what it was like to lose a loved one in a mining accident. The sudden explosions, the unwarranted collapses, He'd lost friends to it. And Samuel, even at 9, had said something that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, in a small house south of town, Sarah Denton bit her lip, trembling as she tore up her 4th letter of the night. She'd been writing to her brother William all night. She'd been trying to warn him, who was working as a first shift foreman at the Silver Creek mine. But how could she explain that she believed the prophecy of a 9-year-old boy in the middle of a church service? How to tell him that? The boy had uttered strange words, sounding native, that she dared not repeat for fear of revealing Samuel's mysterious origins. How to tell him to leave the mine today? Just because a child could see the future. But Sarah wasn't sure what was delusional anymore. She had seen Samuel as a child when he found lost things when no one else could, when he predicted rainstorms with uncanny accuracy, when the animals in the woods seemed to listen to him. She knew that if she kept quiet today, she would regret it for the rest of her life. William Strauss, however, didn't sit still and think. He acted. The 73-year-old had survived 3 mine collapses, one in Pennsylvania, one in Nevada, and one in Colorado itself. He believed in intuition, especially the unexplainable ones. And this time, he believed in Samuel. William rose before dawn. His hands were shaking from arthritis, and he stuffed the provisions, the oil lamp, and some rope into his saddlebags. His old eyes could barely see through the snow, but he had written a few letters in case he didn't return. Then, with shaking hands, he mounted his horse. No one had sent him. No one could stop him. William knew if he didn't make it to Silver Creek in time, maybe no one would. The old prospector set out from Pine Ridge just as the sun crested the eastern peaks, casting long golden shafts across the frost-hardened trail. William Strauss rode alone, his silhouette cutting a fragile line against the pale blue horizon, the crisp morning air clinging to his breath. His mare Constance, an aging but sure-footed creature who had carried him through avalanches and dynamited shafts, moved with quiet urgency along the narrow trail, winding through dense pine forests and across wind-scoured passes. Each hoof-fall echoed into the silent void like a ticking clock. The journey under the best conditions would have taken 6 hours. But the heavy snowdrifts and washed-out ledges turned the path into a gauntlet of hazards. Ice slicks hid beneath crusted layers of snow, and at several points, the trail had all but disappeared, forcing William to dismount and lead Constance along razor-thin switchbacks with 100-foot drops just inches away. Every delay felt fatal. The old man knew he wasn't just racing against the clock, he was battling the indifference of nature, the weight of his own failing body, and the stubborn disbelief that awaited him in Silver Creek. He had to arrive before noon and somehow convince men of industry to believe in a mountain boy's dream. Back in Pine Ridge, the day had barely begun. But Margaret Henderson already felt like it was unraveling. Her son Samuel seemed like a stranger in his own skin. Though he remembered nothing of the prophecy he'd delivered during the church service, something within him did. He paced the floor like a caged animal, eyes wide, hands trembling. Again and again he asked for the time. Then he'd fall into brooding silence, cocking his head as though listening to a sound, far off, always to the south, always towards Silver Creek. Several neighbors who stopped by the cabin later recalled the strange sight of the boy that morning. Mrs. Agnes Caldwell noted how Samuel froze mid-step on the porch, lifting his head toward the mountains, whispering under his breath. Dr. Keller observed that his pupils were unnaturally dilated, his pulse racing signs of either illness or an unseen fear taking root in his nervous system. But it was his words that disturbed them most. "They're going too deep," Samuel muttered to his mother sometime before midday. "The mountain doesn't want them there. Something's waiting in the deep places." Margaret tried everything she could to ground him. Chores, tea, favorite stories. But the boy was unreachable, haunted by things he could neither name nor forget. Neighbors gathered at the Henderson home under the pretense of checking in, but what took shape was something closer to a vigil. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. A storm was coming, not in the sky, but in the ground beneath their feet. The rest of Pine Ridge moved through the morning with unnatural restraint. Children were kept indoors. Tools were inspected and re-inspected. Conversations danced awkwardly around the growing tension. Quilting circles turned into whispered conferences. Even the blacksmith's rhythmic hammering seemed subdued, each strike swallowed by the pine-dark silence. Dr. Keller, ever the observer, scribbled in his worn leather notebook, "Not mass hysteria, not panic. Something quieter, something heavier. A town balancing between belief and disbelief, waiting to see which way the world will tilt." By late morning, even the skeptics had begun glancing toward the southern ridges, ears straining for distant echoes of disaster. Normal sounds felt hollow. Familiar routines lost their rhythm. It was as if the town itself had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. Then, at precisely 12:23 p.m., by the ticking hands of Thomas Henderson's pocket watch, calibrated weekly by the Denver Post Rail, the earth shifted. It was not a quake, not in the way books would later define it. There was no sudden jolt, no plates grinding with violence. But something ancient moved beneath the peaks, and in that moment, all of Pine Ridge knew Samuel had been right. The people of Pine Ridge had known earthquakes before. Out here in the Colorado highlands, the mountains occasionally groaned in their ancient sleep, sending tremors rippling through valleys and creeks. But what happened just after midday on that cold spring day was different. It wasn't a rolling wave or a gentle sway. It struck like a hammer from deep within the earth. A violent, sharp jolt. Then came the sound. Low, guttural, and resonant, it echoed through the valleys like a dying beast groaning from beneath stone. Windows shivered in their panes, cups and plates tumbled from shelves, and a few residents lost their footing entirely. And yet, strangely, Pine Ridge itself was spared any real damage. No buildings fell, no walls cracked. But still, everyone knew what that sound meant. It was the sound of a mountain folding in on itself. The miners in the area would later describe it with chilling precision a collapse. Not a tremor, not a landslide, but the sound of earth devouring its own wounds. Tons upon tons of rock shifting into the hollow spaces men had carved for greed. Somewhere beyond the southern ridges at Silver Creek, a mine had just died. Back in Pine Ridge, young Samuel Henderson had spent the entire morning pacing like an animal before a storm. His agitation had become so acute that neighbors had stopped by to check on the boy, gathering around the Henderson cabin in quiet unease. But when the jolt came, when the mountain groaned, Samuel froze. For a full minute, he didn't move. His eyes went glassy, distant. And then he spoke. His voice was his own but altered as if something had reached through him from beyond the veil. The crow brought them to the light. But 23 sleep now in the mountain's belly, and their silver dreams have turned to stone. Those around him were stunned. Margaret Henderson, his mother, had heard her son speak similarly once before, 3 days earlier, during the strange trance. But this time he remembered it. Not clearly, not in the way one remembers a dream or a conversation, but he felt it. Samuel couldn't explain why he said what he did. But the numbers 17 and 23 would later be confirmed down to the last body. And yet, no one in Pine Ridge would know that for several agonizing hours. That long, dreadful afternoon passed like fog rolling in over the hills, slow, quiet, and suffocating. Word hadn't yet reached them from Silver Creek. People tried to go about their business, but no one could focus. The blacksmith's hammer struck less often. Mothers kept their children close. Even the dogs seemed to bark less. There was a silence that hung over the town, not the peaceful kind, but a charged stillness like air before lightning. And then just before 4 o'clock, a rider appeared at the edge of town. His horse was lathered in sweat, his coat torn. He wasn't from Pine Ridge, but they recognized him quickly. Deputy Marshal Franklin Curtis out of the territorial capital. He'd been on his way to Silver Creek on an unrelated matter, some claim-jumping investigation, when the collapse happened. What he brought was confirmation. The Silver Creek mine had suffered a catastrophic cave-in. Entire shafts, central and secondary, had collapsed into themselves. The rockfall was so complete, so violent, that rescue efforts were almost hopeless before they'd begun. Dozens of men had been working deep inside. Most never made it out. But here's where things became truly strange. 17 miners had survived. Only because moments before the disaster, an old prospector had ridden in with a warning. His name was William Strauss. He had come from Pine Ridge. He'd told them, warned them, that something was wrong, that the tunnels were unstable. And he'd convinced the overseers to evacuate workers from the deepest shafts. Those 17 men were above ground when the mountain swallowed the rest, but 23 others never made it. The numbers Samuel had uttered just hours earlier. Let's pause here for a moment, dear listener. I invite you to think about that. This wasn't a vague prediction. This wasn't superstition or coincidence. The boy had named the exact toll before it happened. Back in town, the reaction to Deputy Curtis's report was a storm of vindication and horror. On one hand, Samuel's strange episode had proven undeniably real. On the other, his truth had arrived too late to save those 23 lives. A chilling question settled over every heart in Pine Ridge. What if we had believed him? For the more religious among them, this was a test of faith. For the scientific minds like Dr. Keller, it defied rational explanation. Could human consciousness somehow tap into forces beyond time? Could grief or trauma open a doorway to something else? And what exactly had spoken through Samuel? Was it his mind trying to cope with an unseen pressure, or something older, something deeper? Deputy Curtis hadn't come to Pine Ridge just to deliver news. He had questions of his own. Namely, how did this old prospector William Strauss know to warn them? Where had he gotten his information? Curtis made clear that Strauss had mentioned Samuel, that his journey had been prompted by the boy's words, which meant this small, isolated town had just become the center of something far greater than a mining tragedy. The official inquiries would begin soon enough, and still, William Strauss had not returned. Deputy Curtis explained that the old man had been injured, nothing fatal, but enough to keep him from attempting the dangerous ride back over the mountain. Word would be sent as soon as his condition improved. But until then, Pine Ridge was left with a silence heavy with implication. People gathered quietly at the church that night. They lit candles, not just for the dead, but for the living, especially the boy. For Samuel Henderson, who had somehow inexplicably seen it all coming, and maybe, just maybe, was beginning to see something more. The tremor had come and gone in less than a minute, but Pine Ridge would feel its echo for generations. At first, the townsfolk thought it might have been an earthquake. They'd felt those before, slow undulating, like the ground was sighing beneath their boots. But this was different. A sharp, violent jolt, like something deep within the earth, had broken loose, followed by a low, resonant groan that rolled through the mountains like a sorrowful hymn. Dishes shattered, lamps toppled, men stumbled in the streets. But strangely, no buildings fell, no chimneys cracked. The town remained intact. What didn't remain intact was hidden beneath Silver Creek. Those familiar with mining knew the sound immediately. That long trembling groan wasn't seismic. It was mechanical. It was man-made. It was the unmistakable roar of a mine collapsing in on itself, of tunnels crumbling under the weight of mountains carved hollow by greed and dynamite. And as that haunting sound faded into silence, young Samuel Henderson, who had been pacing restlessly outside his family's cabin all morning, suddenly stopped, dead still, like a wind-up toy that had wound down. He lifted his head, eyes blank but distant, and said without warning or preamble, "The crow brought them to the light." But 23 sleep now in the mountain's belly, and their silver dreams have turned to stone. Just like that, he was back, awake, confused, breathing hard. But this time, unlike before, Samuel remembered what he'd said. Not all of it. Not the strange language. Not the way his voice had felt like it belonged to someone else. But he remembered the numbers, 17 and 23. He didn't know why they mattered, but they had lodged in his memory like a burr in wool. And oh dear listener, those numbers would prove disturbingly precise. Hours passed, long ones, tense. Nobody said much, nobody had to. By late afternoon, the silence was broken by the thunder of hooves on the trail. A lone rider coat, dusty eyes wild, raced into town like death itself was at his heels. It was Deputy Marshal Franklin Curtis, sent from the territorial capital to investigate reports of claim jumping out near Silver Creek. But he'd ridden straight through after the collapse, and his news chilled the marrow of every soul in Pine Ridge. The mine had buckled. The central shaft and two major tunnels had caved in, completely burying the main operations under thousands of tons of stone. Rescue efforts had begun, but hope was slim. And here's the part no one in Pine Ridge was ready to hear. Just before the collapse, an old prospector, William Strauss, a known hermit from Pine Ridge, had arrived in Silver Creek with a warning. He'd convinced the foreman to pull 17 men from the most unstable zone. Those 17 were safe, alive, but 23 others had been too deep, gone. The numbers 17 and 23 were exactly as Samuel had uttered them hours earlier. Now, friends, I want you to pause with me for a moment. Imagine you lived in that town. Imagine the wind, the mountains, the silence after the quake, and now this. The boy had not only predicted the collapse, but the cost, down to the last soul. How would you feel? Vindicated, terrified? Maybe both. Because Pine Ridge felt all of it at once. The elation of saved lives mingled with the crushing weight of lost ones. And hanging over it all was the dreadful question, could more have been saved? If they'd just believed. William Strauss had trusted the boy. He'd risked his life crossing mountain trails to deliver a warning based on nothing but the ravings of a restless child. And in doing so, he'd saved 17 men from a burial of stone and silence. Without Samuel, without William, the death toll would have been 40. 40. Samuel Henderson was no longer just a curious case or a troubled child. He had become something far more unsettling, a prophet, and that realization came with a heavier burden than anyone in Pine Ridge was ready to carry. Thomas and Margaret Henderson suddenly found themselves at the center of a storm of attention they had never been prepared for. Neighbors who had once viewed Samuel as just another good boy in town now viewed him with a mixture of fear and admiration, a change that left Samuel bewildered. Strangers flocked to Pine Ridge from all over the neighborhood, bringing hope, curiosity, and intrigue. Some wanted the boy prophet to guide them. Some were skeptical and came to expose what they believed to be a hoax. And some, sadly, were simply fame seekers hoping to turn the little prophet into a tool for their own gain. The Hendersons were on the defensive. Thomas was repeatedly questioned about Samuel's origins, especially when rumors of the boy's Native American words during his trances began to circulate again. Some people seemed to be trying to prove that the child was not entirely natural, that his powers came from somewhere else, from a spiritual or even supernatural dimension. What hurt Thomas and Margaret most, however, was Samuel's own reaction. He was beginning to understand that he was no longer a normal child in the eyes of others, and that made him miserable. Samuel often asked his adoptive parents if he had done something wrong, why people avoided him, were afraid of him. He had no desire to become a prophet, just to play like other children, help his mother cook, and follow his father to the fields. But then, the fateful day came. A week after the first prophecy on a Sunday morning like any other, the man who would change everything arrived at Pine Ridge. His name was Dr. Harrison Blake. The Denver doctor was a staunch scientist, a believer that no supernatural phenomenon could be explained by reason and observation. Rumors of the Sage Boy had reached the medical community of Colorado, and Dr. Blake saw this as a rare opportunity to study an unusual neurological case. He wasn't looking for revelations, he was looking for abnormalities in the brain. Carrying a leather satchel full of primitive medical instruments and a notebook crammed with notes on epilepsy, dissociative disorders, and the effects of high altitude on the immature brain, Dr. Blake entered Pine Ridge like a cold wind cutting through the town's sensitive, spiritual atmosphere. Deep down, he believed that Samuel was the victim of some form of neurological disease, or worse, the product of an unconscious collective deception. Meanwhile, a familiar face returns to Pine Ridge after a long stay in hospital, William Strauss, who risked his life to deliver Samuel's warning. His body still bears the scars of the mine collapse, but his eyes shine with something greater than his personal pain, the truth. Willem brings back a detailed account of the collapse, and it's these details that are truly chilling. Samuel speaks of a raven leading light into darkness. No one understands what he means at the time, but after the accident, a dead raven is found at the entrance to the most dangerous tunnel, a long abandoned tunnel that was unexpectedly scheduled to reopen on the day of the collapse. Only a few high-ranking people in the company know about the plan. Samuel has no way of knowing unless Willem continues. Samuel also said that silver stains the blood of men. A poetic statement, if it weren't so real at the scene of the accident. As the rubble was cleared, a small stream was found where the water had turned red, mixed with silver ore and the miners' blood. Dear Sleepy History Tales viewers, if you're shivering, you're not alone. At this point, the people in the story are feeling it too, because what's happening can no longer be denied. It's not coincidence, it's not superstition, and it's not easy to blame it on epilepsy. A confrontation is brewing between the cold rationality of modern medicine and the mysteries that science cannot explain. And in the middle is a 9-year-old boy who just wants to be a kid again. Thomas and Margaret Henderson were suddenly the center of attention, but not in the way any of the parents had hoped. Neighbors who had once regarded Samuel as just another ordinary boy now regarded him with a mixture of admiration and fear, a change that the boy felt keenly and was certainly not pleasant. Rumors of the prophetic child began to spread, drawing streams of people from neighboring towns. Some curious, some hoping for miracles, and some with disturbing questions about Samuel's true origins. The boy's unconscious use of Ute words in a trance revived old rumors that Samuel was not adopted by accident, that he might have something different, something ancient and sacred that could not be named. Thomas was pressed to tell the story of the day he found Samuel, and many were clearly hoping to hear evidence of the child's supernatural past. But what worried the Hendersons most was Samuel's own reaction. The 9-year-old boy began to withdraw, to become anxious, to ask his foster parents what he had done to make them fear him. The weight of adult expectations and fears weighed heavily on a child who just wanted to play, help his parents, and live like a normal person. And my friends, the story gets more complicated. As the boy's reputation spread beyond Pine Ridge, many people began to flock to the small village, each with their own motives. Some wanted to ask for a prophecy. Some came to expose the truth, suspecting that it was all a hoax. And of course, there were those who wanted to exploit Samuel's special abilities for wealth or fame. Each new arrival brought new complications, forcing the Hendersons to be more vigilant and to guard their son's privacy more closely. This tension came to a head on Sunday, February 25th, exactly 1 week after the first prophecy, when a strange visitor arrived bringing with him a completely different worldview, Dr. Harrison Blake from Denver. Dr. Blake. My friend was a man of pure science. He believed that all phenomena, even the most mysterious, could be explained by observation and rational analysis. He arrived at Pine Ridge with a bag full of early medical instruments and a mind full of theories about epilepsy hysteria and the effects of high altitude on the brain. To him, Samuel was either a rare case of mental illness or a spectacular public hoax. His arrival coincided with the return of William Strauss, a gold miner who survived the collapse. William brought chilling testimony. Samuel's prophecy was not only accurate in time and substance, but also accurate in detail, to the point of being hard to believe. For example, the prophecy, "Ravens will bring light to the darkness," sounds far-fetched. Yet that very morning, a dead raven was found at the entrance to the most dangerous mine shaft, a place that had been abandoned but was actually about to be repurposed as part of the mine's secret expansion plan. No one but a few high-ranking officials knew about this. And then there was the phrase, "Silver will flow like blood." Who would have thought that the collapse had broken an underground water source, and now the sparkling water in the shaft had turned red with minerals, creating the exact image as prophesied. Even the Ute words that Samuel uttered, "The mountain remembers and the dead sleep beneath," were genuine phrases that Willem had heard from his native guides years before. Dr. Blake listened to it all with the cool head of a scientist, searching for inconsistencies or signs of fabrication. But the witnesses were trustworthy, and the details were too precise to be easily dismissed. So, he decided he had to observe the child for himself. The opportunity came that Sunday morning at church. Picture this. My friend, a small church, packed with people. The tension was suffocating. Samuel had sat there all week like a normal boy, but when the priest began his sermon, he suddenly stood up. And once again the crowded room held its breath as his gaze grew distant, and his voice rang out, not that of a child, but something much older and more powerful. But this time, there were no distant warnings. This time he began calling out names one by one in the church. Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael. Samuel said, his green eyes fixed on a middle-aged woman in the 4th row. "The baby you lost in December did not die of a fever, as you said. It was born prematurely from herbs you gathered in secret to avoid childbirth. God saw your pain, but also the sin in your heart." The room was silent. Mrs. Carmichael was pale, shivering, as if the cold had penetrated her. No one knew, no one but her. And now, the entire congregation was looking at her as if she had heard a confession from heaven. Samuel continued, now looking toward the back of the church, Peter Atwood. "The gambling debts you've hidden from your family will bring violence to this place in 2 weeks. They're not just coming for money, they want blood. And your shame will cost innocent people." Peter Atwood, the young man who worked as a hunting guide, was frozen. The moneylenders of Silver Creek were not easy to deal with. He knew that. But no one here should know. And then Samuel turned to Dr. Blake. "I must warn you." This moment left the church breathless. Dr. Harrison Blake. He said, his voice ringing like a stone bell in a deep cavern. You came here with tools and doctrines wanting to explain the divine, with measuring rods and test tubes. But you brought your own darkness with you, the patients in Denver, who gave their souls and minds to you. How many have died under your experimental methods? How many have been hurt because you considered knowledge more important than healing? You want to cage the eagle, but there are secrets that must be hidden. Beware the price of knowledge, for the mountain sees all and will claim its debt in its own way. Dr. Blake, the man who believed in reason, sat there dumbfounded. Those words were not just a suggestion, they were the truth. The dark truth he had never confessed, of his unethical experiments with the brains of patients, the damage he left behind, and the death he hid, and friends. This was only the beginning. The collapse of the mine had done more than claim lives and crush stone. It had torn open the very heart of the mountain, and with it, something ancient had been stirred awake. An underground stream had been ruptured by the blast. Now, it surged through the ruins, running red with iron oxide, a river of blood beneath the earth. And to those who had heard Samuel's strange prophecy, weeks before the meaning was chillingly clear, the mountain weeps where men have dug too deep. Old Will, once a prospector, now a haunted observer, confirmed what few could deny Samuel's words. Those strange phrases that had startled the churchgoers were not nonsense. They were Ute, the language of the people who once walked this land with reverence instead of drills. The phrases translated simply, "The mountain remembers. Death sleeps in the deep places." These weren't words a child like Samuel should have known. And yet, he had spoken them with ease. Dr. Harrison Blake listened carefully, lips tight, his physician's mind tugging against something older than science. He tried to pick apart the stories, seeking inconsistencies, exaggerations, anything to explain away the supernatural. But the deeper he listened, the harder that task became. He decided he would need to examine the boy himself, directly, professionally, privately. That chance came sooner than expected. It was a Sunday. The pews were filled past bursting. Families had come not for worship, but for wonder to witness the boy prophet. A kind of electric tension filled the church, as if heaven itself were holding its breath. And then Samuel stood. The transformation was immediate. One moment, a child in simple clothes. The next, a figure of eerie composure, eyes pale green and ancient. But this time, something was different. The prophecy didn't speak of mine collapses or mountains. No. This time, Samuel looked into the souls of those present, and he began to name names. "Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael," he said calmly, voice loud enough to stop breath. "The child you lost last December was not taken by fever as you told your neighbors. It was born early, because of the herbs you gathered in secret. The mountain knows. God sees your grief. But he also sees your guilt." The church went still. Mrs. Carmichael, seated in the fourth pew, turned as pale as linen. Her body trembled. She clutched her dress, unable to speak. Samuel had told the truth once she had buried deep even from her husband. The whispers began. Samuel's gaze shifted. "Peter Atwood," he called next. "You've hidden your debts in Silver Creek, but they are not forgotten. They come with guns, not warnings. You have marked your house with blood, and that stain will not be silent. Peter, a wiry teenager sitting near the back, froze. He looked around the church, panic rising. His gambling had been a secret, a desperate one. But now, it was out. But the prophecy's final target stunned even the skeptics. Samuel turned his gaze upon Dr. Blake himself. Dr. Harrison Blake, the boy intoned, each syllable falling like a funeral bell. You come seeking explanations. But who explains you? The patients in Denver. Those who trusted your hands, your mind, your promise of healing. How many left your care broken? How many were fed to your hunger for discovery? You chase truth without mercy. But the mountain demands balance. Some debts can only be paid in blood. Dr. Blake's breath left him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. What Samuel said was impossible, and yet terrifyingly accurate. His private experiments in Denver, the unauthorized treatments, the failures the silence bought with paperwork and shame, no one could have known except the boy. And Samuel wasn't finished. Now he addressed the entire congregation again, his voice curling into those Ute tones, full of echo and wind and earth. The child who speaks to you was born beneath the sacred peaks, where the old spirits still walk. His blood remembers what white men forget. The crowd leaned in, frozen, listening. The visions are not blessings, Samuel whispered. They are wounds. Each one tears the soul. The mountain grows hungrier with every word I speak, and soon it will call for payment. A hush fell so deep that the church might have been buried in snow. Then Samuel's voice softened. He spoke of a memory, something no one, not even Thomas Henderson, had ever revealed. Of hiding in a cellar, of screams above, of blood, of rituals, Ute prayers and firelight, moments before his family was wiped out. He spoke of how trauma had hidden his gifts, locked them away until grief and silence broke the seal. And then he spoke the prophecy that would haunt Dr. Blake for the rest of his life. Before the moon grows dark again, Samuel said, you will face a choice between knowledge and mercy. The mountain will be watching, and if you choose wrong, the price will be your soul. A breath, then silence. And then Samuel changed. He collapsed into himself, his voice gone, his gaze no longer otherworldly, but terrified. A boy again, a child. And then the tears came, not quiet, embarrassed tears, but deep, shaking sobs, the cries of someone who had seen too much, someone far too young to carry what he carried. The church was still, reverent, frightened. The fallout began almost immediately. Mrs. Carmichael's secret spread fast, too fast. Judgments were swift and cruel. Her husband, devastated, struggled to reconcile the lie. Within weeks, they packed up and left Pine Ridge, broken in more ways than one. Peter Atwood's prophecy came true too. Men from Silver Creek arrived with loaded guns. Peter vanished into the mountains. Some say he still lives out there, wild-eyed, alone, clinging to the edges of the known world. But the most damning confirmation came from Dr. Blake himself, and sleepy history tales. We'll take you into that moment in the next part of our story. Stay close. The mountain still remembers. Shaken to his core by the eerie precision of Samuel's vision, Dr. Blake found himself gripped by a fascination he could no longer resist. The boy had spoken of things no outsider should know, details about Blake's secret neurological experiments hidden even from his closest colleagues. The rational man of science had arrived in Pine Ridge to study an anomaly, but now he was chasing something much darker and far more personal. He quietly extended his stay in Pine Ridge, weaving excuses to remain near the Hendersons. But as the weeks wore on, his examinations of Samuel grew more intense and increasingly intrusive. Despite repeated objections from Thomas and Margaret, Blake began running a series of invasive tests, probing for answers that danced just beyond the reach of medical understanding. What he found only deepened the mystery. Samuel's brain bore evidence of early trauma, blunt force injuries likely sustained during the violent slaughter of his birth family. But there was something more. Blake discovered unusual neural pathways, complex and overdeveloped in regions associated with sensory processing and emotional resonance. It was as if Samuel's brain had restructured itself around the catastrophe that birthed him. The doctor proposed that the boy's so-called visions might in fact be a form of hyper-evolved environmental sensitivity, a survival mechanism so finely tuned that it appeared supernatural. But this gift came with a cost. Each prophetic episode left Samuel drained, weak, and often feverish. The boy would sleep for days, trembling under thick quilts, his tiny frame shaking with exhaustion. Worse still, the episodes were becoming more frequent, more intense. The line between his visions and his reality was beginning to blur. Blake grew desperate. He couldn't just observe anymore, he had to provoke to trigger the next episode on his terms. He subjected the boy to controlled stress, emotional sensory, even pharmacological stimuli, hoping to measure and map the mechanics behind the phenomenon. And so, prophecy became procedure. But then one day, Samuel slipped into a state unlike any Blake had ever documented. His voice changed, his body stiffened, and instead of predicting storms or collapses or deaths, he began to speak of his own. He described it with eerie clarity, a cold slab sterile metal, Blake's own instruments lying bloody and still beside his body, and the doctor frozen horrified, holding a scalpel that had carved too deep into the mystery. The vision matched nothing Blake had asked, but everything he had feared. And in that moment, Blake realized the horrifying truth. Samuel had predicted this too. You will face a choice between knowledge and mercy, the boy had said. And here it was. If Blake continued, he might unravel the mystery, but he would destroy the boy in the process. He stepped away. Blake's final report to the Colorado Territorial Medical Association was clinical detached but carried an unmistakable tone of regret. He described Samuel Henderson as a case of extraordinary neural adaptation born from trauma ancestry and unknown cognitive phenomena. A blend, he suggested, of inherited Native American shamanic knowledge and biological anomaly. But he closed the report with a warning. This was not a gift that could be dissected without cost. Samuel's mind, Blake wrote, was a delicate vessel. Push too far, and the gift would shatter, taking the boy with it. Blake's recommendation was clear: leave him be. No more tests, no more experiments. Let the gift fade if it must, but protect the child. And fade it did. As Samuel entered adolescence, the visions became sporadic, muddled, then disappeared entirely. By age 15, they were gone. He remembered flashes, half-formed dreams, feelings, voices, but never again would he speak with the thunder of prophecy. The boy who once whispered with the mountain spirits returned to a quiet, ordinary life, but Pine Ridge could never forget. Some families left unable to bear the weight of exposed sins or the constant dread of what Samuel might one day remember. Others stayed but kept their distance, treating the boy with a wary reverence as if any moment might bring another reckoning. The Hendersons tried to rebuild their peace, but peace is a fragile thing when you've raised a child who once spoke with the dead. And Reverend Matthews, the sermons he gave after 1867 were never the same. He didn't call Samuel a prophet, not allowed, but his words softened. His certainty faded. He preached humility, the danger of arrogance, the mystery of grace. And in his final years, he kept a journal with only one entry repeated again and again. The mountain remembers. So should we. The Reverend's faith had always seemed unshakable, rooted in scripture, structured by tradition. But after witnessing what unfolded with Samuel Henderson, even he found himself re-evaluating the boundaries between natural law and divine mystery. His sermons grew quieter, more contemplative. He stopped speaking in absolutes. And though he never formally declared Samuel's visions to be divine revelations, his words hinted at something deeper. A new humility bloomed in his theology, an acknowledgement that maybe the divine sometimes speaks through means we're not prepared to recognize. This quiet evolution in the Reverend's beliefs would ripple through the Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church for generations. A new openness took root in the community. An understanding that the world didn't always divide neatly between sacred and scientific, that the truth sometimes lived in the blur between them. As for Samuel, he grew into a quiet, introspective man. No longer the wide-eyed boy who had seen too much too soon, but someone who had learned to live alongside the mysteries inside him. He channeled his gift into something tangible, becoming a respected surveyor and cartographer. His maps of the Colorado mountains were so precise, so eerily intuitive, that even veteran geologists took note. Some said he could read the land, like a story, feeling the silent shifts in the ground, beneath sensing hidden patterns in stone and wind. Samuel married Sarah Denton, whose brother had been among the 17 men saved by his early warning. Together, they raised 3 children in Pine Ridge in a modest home nestled among the pines. He never spoke of his childhood prophecies, not in public, and rarely even to family. But those who knew him best said he never lost that subtle connection to the earth. He could still predict storms with uncanny accuracy, still warn when the mountains felt off. He just never called it a gift, never called it anything at all. He simply helped quietly. But the legacy of Samuel Henderson stretched far beyond Pine Ridge. As word of the case spread across Colorado and beyond, it drew all kinds of attention. Medical researchers eager to study neurological anomalies, theologians searching for signs of modern-day prophets, and skeptics trying to debunk it all. Some saw Samuel as proof of something divine, others as a tragic example of trauma warping perception. But no one could ignore the accuracy of his predictions. The collapse happened. 17 lives were spared. Dr. Blake's detailed reports were published in medical journals and even became required reading at several teaching hospitals. He described Samuel as a case of extreme neurological adaptation and extraordinary sensitivity developed through childhood trauma, perhaps even influenced by Native American ancestral knowledge passed down through unknown means. He wrote of a brain rewired by pain, capable of reading environmental cues that others could never perceive. Blake's conclusions stirred fierce debate in both scientific and spiritual circles. Some praised his work as a groundbreaking approach to understanding the brain's latent capacities. Others accused him of reducing something sacred to cold biology. Religious scholars too found themselves split. Some heralded Samuel as a bridge between traditions, a child who spoke the language of both native spirituality and Christian faith. Others struggled with what it meant if miracles could be explained, or worse, recreated. But perhaps the deepest mark was left right where it all began. Pine Ridge was never the same. Some families left unable to bear the lingering fear that secrets might still surface. Others stayed but kept their distance from the Henderson family, treating Samuel with a complex mix of awe, gratitude, and quiet unease. Children were taught to respect him but not to ask questions. The community, once skeptical and tight-lipped, learned instead to live with mystery, to accept that not everything needed to be explained. The Silver Creek mine where 23 men had died was never reopened. Officially, it was due to structural instability. But locals whispered a different reason, that the mine had been cursed. Not by dark magic, but by truth ignored. By a boy's voice dismissed until it was too late. The jagged ruins of that mine became a kind of monument, not just to the lives lost, but to the dangers of certainty and to the cost of arrogance. For years, visitors came to Pine Ridge hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy prophet. They didn't find him. By his 15th birthday, the visions had stopped completely. What once felt like a gateway to something greater had closed, quietly and without warning. All that remained were faint memories and questions. So many questions. How many children like Samuel have there been throughout history? Their warnings unheard, their gifts misunderstood. What hidden combination of biology, trauma, and environment could unlock a consciousness that bends what we think is possible? And what are we to do as communities when someone among us sees something? We can't, even if it defies everything we believe. Samuel Henderson's story doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it challenges us to confront the limits of what we think we know, to recognize that science and faith may not always be at odds, but sometimes whispering the same truth in different tongues. That perhaps the line between miracle and mechanism is thinner than we dare admit, and that truth, real truth, often lives not in tidy conclusions, but in uncomfortable uncertainty. So now, dear listener, I leave it to you. Was Samuel Henderson simply a traumatized child with an unusually sensitive brain, a product of rare neurology and ancestral intuition? Or was he something more? Was his gift, however it worked, a reminder that the world still holds wonders far beyond our understanding? Tell us what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And if this tale left you thinking twice about what's possible, consider sharing it with someone who loves the strange and the unexplained. Give this video a like, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, and don't forget to hit that little bell so you don't miss what's next. Until then, stay curious, stay open, and remember, some stories don't have to be proven to be true. They only have to be heard. Good night.